we learn about sex by what we witness in the media and what we pick up from social learning, something psychologists call social learning theory. When it comes to sex, we don't witness how anyone else is doing it, really. We only see what happens on TV and what happens in porn and maybe hear from our friends, but we don't really know if they're telling the truth or not. So what that means then is that we're all living our sex lives based on something we call sexual script theory. This is a concept that organically came out of the work of some sex researchers in the 70s called Gagnon and Simon. And they discovered that actually in the absence of talking about sex, we all have quite set ideas about what our sex lives should look like. And we've picked this up from the media, from how people talk about sex in popular culture, and in how we've used language. What this means is that we have a set of ideas, and this includes things like penis and vagina is the main course of sex, and everything else isn't really sex. And language backs that up, doesn't it? With the use of the word foreplay, kind of relegating any other type of sex to less than, and the use of the word virginity, which we only really use to refer to penis and vagina sex. So all of these things tell us, well, that's what real sex is. And then you hear people talking about that and backing that up with things like, well, we did everything but, which is like, we didn't have sex. But you did have sex because you were sexual together. So what happens with these sexual scripts is that they benefit us to some degree because they reduce our anxiety. That's what sexual scripts are there for, to give us some idea of what's expected. But what they do to us in the absence of communication is they give us an idea about what we should be doing or what someone else wants to do without us having to talk about it, which often means that problems arise.
For example, one of the examples you give in your book is about orgasms.
Yes.
And pornography giving us a sexual script that men are basically meant, in a heterosexual relationship, men are meant to orgasm. And that there was some crazy stat from some Pornhub research.
Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting research. There was some research that talked about depictions of female pleasure and pleasure-inducing acts for women from the 100 most popular videos on Pornhub. And they found that women's pleasure was shown in about 18% of those top 100 videos, and men's pleasure, or acts that produce pleasure for men, mainly around penis and vagina sex, because that's men's most favorite sexual act. It's women's least favorite sexual act. That was depicted in about 78% of cases. So it's quite interesting then when you think about the fact that we're learning from what we see, because what does that then tell us about what sex should look like, about when sex ends, about whose pleasure is prioritized? And it's one of the reasons that we have an orgasm gap when men and women have sex together, because that's how we learn about sex.
On that, I just want to pick up on two things you said there that were really interesting to me. The first one was about us not talking, why we don't talk. It's very difficult to talk about sex with your partner.
Very.
Very difficult. I've been there. Very difficult because the plethora of reasons why you might not be functioning well or enjoying it can often sound like you're blaming them.
Communication is so important. We know that being able to talk about sex is one of the most highly correlated factors with long-term sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction and maintaining desire over time. It's more important than the amount you have sex, liking the same things sexually. It's so important, but it's so hard to do. And we know why it's hard, right? It's because we're not socialized to talk about it. We're not often given the words that feel comfortable. We are out of practice getting those words out of our mouth, so they feel kind of clumsy and awkward. There's a lot of worry and risk involved. What if I say this and they don't like it? And because of that, it's easier to avoid. But the most fascinating thing about sex, I think, is that it's constantly evolving for us. So you and I, we're not the same people sexually than we were when we were 15, 16, and we won't be the same sexual people in another 10, 15 years than we are now. So we need to be able to have the ability for growth, right? Growth and flex in our sexual relationships. But how do you do that if you can't talk about it? It's a bit like going to the hairdressers, the same hairdressers for the rest of your life. And every time you sit down, not saying anything and just hoping that they'll give you the haircut that you want, you wouldn't do it, right?
And they continually give you the bad
Yeah.
one and you just keep coming back.
And you say thanks and you tip them and you go. So we need to get better at talking about it. And it's not easy. It's easy for me. I talk about it all day, every day, but I know that that's not the norm. And part of the work that I do is to try and help people, try and give people the scaffold to talk about it. And I can talk you through that if you like.
Please.
So it might be that the best place to start is to find out how people find talking about challenging topics anyway with their partner. So if you can't talk about other things outside of sex without it going into an argument, then it might be worth just looking at communication, full stop. Forget sex for the moment. Just talk about that.
Are you creating some like rules of engagement for how we communicate? You listen, I express myself.
Absolutely. And I always recommend the Gottmans. I don't know if you know their work.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
I recommend them because they have some great resources around general communication. It's important to have a good basis if you're going to talk about sex. But if people can talk about other things and they find it relatively easy to hear each other and to share their kind of hopes and fears, then it might be useful to start to create a culture where talking about sex becomes the norm. This is always the place you want to end up, right? We all want to end up with a relationship culture that supports easy communication about sex. That's the guaranteed route to sexual satisfaction. And to do that, we have to make it something that we do frequently without any pressure, without any expectation that something big has to change. So an early way to start that might be, for example, to bring in some novelty in your communications about sex. So people might be listening to this podcast and they might say, oh, how was your day today? Great. Oh, I heard this thing on Diary of a CEO podcast and it was about depictions of pleasure in porn. And I thought it was really interesting. And it occurred to me, we don't talk about porn much. You know, is that something you'd be open to talk about? Whether you watch it, whether you like it, what you like. That might feel too much for some people. And it might be, I heard a podcast about sex and it talked about the importance of talking. And I thought, we don't do that much. So there's ways of bringing it in, which are saying, look, this I think would be good for us. The key point is stating the impact that you think it will have. So I would like to talk more about this because I heard it means you can guarantee great sex for the rest of your life. So I think that would be good for us. You know, I'm committed to this relationship. I want our sex to stay great. This might be awkward for us, but can we do it? So the starting point, if you're nervous, is always to talk about things outside of your sexual relationship. Things you've heard on podcasts, films you saw with good sex scenes in them. Bring things in rather than talking about the two of you. After that, if you get good at that, it might be worthwhile talking about your own sex when it goes well. So a good time to do this is after sex that's gone well, or at another time when you're feeling really emotionally connected. Maybe you're out for dinner, maybe you're having a weekend away, and talk about what you really liked and why.
Okay, so don't talk about it when it's bad.
No, not at this stage. Not at this stage. If you feel confident with that and you get into a habit of talking about sex, talking about what's gone well, talking about sex as if it's any other topic of conversation, like business or exercise or diet, then you might want to start to talk about things you'd like to be different. And in an ideal world, I try and encourage couples to have a kind of regular practice of this. So if you think about your goals for your exercise, your work, your diet, often you'll set yourself goals, right? And you might tell your partner about them. You know, in 6 months from now, I want to do this, or this year I'm working on this. It's quite good to get into the habit of saying, where do we want our sex life to go? How would we like things to be? What do we want to continue? What do we want more of? And what do we want less of? And that's a really positive conversation. You don't need to talk about what you don't like. You're talking about what you want more of instead.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.